April 9, 1865. Inside a Virginia farmhouse owned by Wilmer McLean, the bloodiest war in American history quietly wound down. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, dressed in his finest ceremonial uniform, sat across from a mud-spattered Ulysses S. Grant to accept defeat. Grant offered terms that shocked everyone in the room. There would be no firing squads and no trials. Confederate soldiers were simply told to go home. Officers kept their sidearms, and any man who owned a horse could take it back for spring planting. The nation was finally ready to heal. But that peace lasted exactly 5 days. On April 14th, John Wilkes Booth crept into a box at Ford's Theater and fired a derringer into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The man who held the fractured country together died the next morning. Out on the frontier, the fighting didn't even stop. Information traveled so slowly in 1865 that Confederate units in Texas had no idea Lee had surrendered.
They kept shooting at Union soldiers for weeks after the ink dried at Appomattox. We like to imagine that wars end the moment a treaty is signed, but an entire nation mobilized for slaughter carries massive physical momentum. You can't just flip a switch and turn off a war. On the night of August 14, 1945, a group of rogue Japanese army officers drew their swords and stormed the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. They killed the commander of the Imperial Guard and began searching the complex room by room. They were hunting for a phonograph record. Emperor Hirohito had just taped a message announcing Japan's surrender, and these rebels wanted to destroy it to force the country to fight to the last citizen. They never found the disc. It was hidden in a pile of laundry inside a servant's quarters. The next morning, radios across the country broadcast the emperor's voice for the very first time. Hearing the word surrender from their living God broke the nation's psyche. Women collapsed in the streets, and thousands of military officers chose to kill themselves with swords or grenades rather than accept defeat. 2 weeks later, the world was shown a highly sanitized version of this end. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials in top hats quietly signed the formal surrender documents during a brief 18-minute ceremony. But scattered across remote Pacific islands, some soldiers refused to believe the broadcast. Second Lieutenant Hiro Onada waged a one-man guerrilla campaign in the Philippine jungle for 29 years, only emerging to hand over his tattered sword in 1974. When a state spends years conditioning its people for absolute existential combat, the psychological demobilization of its most devout fighters becomes nearly impossible. By April 1975, the United States had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were used in all of World War II, yet South Vietnam was collapsing at a speed that defied every military projection. Cities expected to hold out for months fell in a matter of hours. The total institutional death of the Republic of Vietnam occurred on the morning of April 30th. North Vietnamese tanks crashed straight through the wrought iron gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. When the South Vietnamese president offered a peaceful transfer of power, the opposing officer cut him off, stating he had no power left to transfer. Hours earlier, the American embassy was gripped by panic. Ambassador Graham Martin had refused to believe Saigon would fall, fatally delaying Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. When the order finally came down, thousands of Vietnamese citizens who had worked with the Americans stormed the embassy gates. Marines used the rifle butts to push back the desperate crowds, while mothers threw their children over barbed wire fences, hoping strangers would pull them onto the final flights out. Thousands of those allies were left on the tarmac. Many were executed, while others spent decades brutalized in remote re-education camps for the crime of trusting the United States. The United States spent 20 years and hundreds of thousands of lives trying to prevent a communist reunification in Vietnam. In the end, the Americans were reduced to climbing ladders to a helicopter, fleeing the exact disaster they had created. In the winter of 1950, American Marines found themselves surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir. In temperatures dropping to 35 degrees below zero, men's feet froze solid inside their boots, and the dead froze so hard they couldn't be buried. This map shows the extreme geographic volatility of the Korean War.
In June 1950, a surprise North Korean invasion pushed United States and South Korean forces into a tiny, desperate pocket around the southern city of Busan. Facing total annihilation, General Douglas MacArthur launched a massive amphibious landing at Incheon, deep behind enemy lines. The maneuver collapsed the North Korean army overnight, and United Nations forces surged north toward the Chinese border. But then, 300,000 Chinese troops flooded across the Yalu River. They drove the Americans back south in one of the most brutal retreats in military history, settling the front line almost exactly where the war began, the 38th parallel. For the next 2 years, the lines barely moved. Soldiers died by the thousands fighting over useless, frozen hills that would be abandoned the very next week, while politicians sat in safe rooms arguing over the terms of a ceasefire. On July 27, 1953, generals from both sides gathered in a small wooden building in Panmunjom to finally stop the bleeding. But the document sitting on the table was not a peace treaty, it was an armistice. An armistice is a formal agreement between warring parties to temporarily stop fighting, but it does not officially end the war. Because a final settlement was never achieved, the two Koreas are technically still at war today. 28,000 American troops still patrol a heavily armed border, maintaining a temporary pause that has stretched into its 7th decade. It takes only a single order to mobilize an army and start a conflict, but cleanly ending a war is an impossible feat. The physical fighting might stop, but the momentum of violence leaves scars, borders, and broken nations that take generations to heal.